Our final speaker for today is Professor Ferenc Hörcher, who is a political philosopher, a historian of political thought, and a philosopher of art and an aesthetician. And in fact, what I said at the very beginning of the conference about Bruegel's painting of the country dance originated in a discussion we had with Ferenc about the meaning of the picture.
Thank you for the copyright.
So, Ferenc studied in Budapest, Oxford, and in Brussels, in Leuven. He's a professor of philosophy and I'm probably not going to pronounce that correctly, the Pázmány-Péter Catholic University, and he's also the director of the Institute of Philosophy at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And he teaches in many places, including the Jagiellonian University in Poland, which I just found out very recently, and I'm quite intrigued about. This evening he's going to talk to us about the concept of a person from a Catholic-Aristotelian perspective. So please give a very, very warm welcome to Professor Ferenc Hörcher.
Thank you, Mikolaj, for this embarrassing introduction. It's really great to be here, and I'm happy to be able to present this final talk. I try to be as concise as possible and ready to discuss things. This is not a written paper, partly because I haven't finished it, and partly because I find written papers read out by foreign speakers sometimes boring. So I try to speak from this sort of notes that you can follow if you cannot understand everything that I talk about. Anyway, I've got 4 points to say. Yes, I'm a political philosopher and a historian of political thought, and these are the two perspectives that I will use in order to try to make sense of this Catholic-Aristotelian position. It's well, sometimes I call it Catholic-Aristotelian, sometimes Christian-Aristotelian, and you will see why. But it's my own position, to be sure. It has got these adjectives, but it's not belonging to any religion or whatever. So I start out from what I call the deadlock of liberalism. And I try to reach out from that into the historical roots of modernity and see the Protestant and the Catholic genres that might help to find an alternative to that understanding of the connection between the individual and the community that I call as a deadlock in liberal contemporary liberalism, and then I will come up to the conceptual alternative that I will try to make out, and I have got two conclusive questions, so hopefully that's not to be worried about. Okay, so the first point is this deadlock. What is that deadlock about? I think that there are two sides to it. There is a practical, well, actually we have run too far. The practical problem is this. I claim that when you are given a society that is multicultural, you are in a hard, you are in a difficult position to call it a community, a political community. Why? Because I want to use the strong concept of a political community, and that means that it should have, well, one culture, basically, one political culture. And if that does not stand, then you can hardly say that it's a political community. So, and if it's not a political community, that means that there are difficulties to keep it going on. So, I mean, to keep the state-run society. So that's the practical problem. What's the conceptual problem? Well, I think that you can reach it through two concepts. One is the concept of negative freedom, or negative liberty, which presents the individual as the ultimate reference point. And through that, it arrives to the conclusion that freedom is nothing more than lacking certain constraints. And to present this as the ideal case, liberty as the lack of constraints, is depoliticizing politics. And in this way, again, we arrive quite logically to a position where society cannot be kept together, cannot be governed, because it got depoliticized. It's zero level of politics that is required in order to have this sort of freedom. And then there is another way to reach this analytical way, the deadlock, and that's a reference to the concept of the unencumbered self. Well, this is a criticism of the Rawlsian way of understanding justice through this methodological tool of the veil of ignorance and the natural original position, which is again a way to cut the connections, cut the links between the individual and her community. And again, we are left in a situation when the individual is left alone and society is depoliticized. You cannot really say much more about it, but that it should satisfy the conditions of this original position. And that's not really what we used to understand by politics. So I claim that if you add these two things together, then you arrive at a position when the balance between the individual and the community is at least threatened. And there are certain conclusions that come out of it, but I don't want to lose much time about that. And I think that this is exactly what Böckenförde, the German constitutional lawyer, recognized in the Böckenförde paradox, which claims that liberal societies have to confront a situation when they cannot reproduce themselves. There is no guarantee, to in each generation to reconstruct the moral foundations upon which this democracy should be built. And this paradox was confronted in a dialogue between Habermas and Ratzinger. And the conclusion of that quite interesting dialogue was that, in fact, there is perhaps a need to look at how communities in the Christian traditions looked like, and to look at the experience of these communities. So that's why I try to make a detour, a historical reconstruction of how these communities were imagined, or how people who had the experience of these communities thought about community. And the first, in this historical part, I concentrate on the concept of sociability, because I think that that is exactly that is denied in the liberal paradigm when they say that the individual is the ultimate target of political philosophy, that what you require is to cut the links between the individual and her community. So let's see how sociability is looked at in this tradition. And I think that what needs to be understood is that in the modern paradigm, there is a reconstruction of the ancient way of understanding this link. And I think that already in the medieval context, we have this reception of the ancient ideas. And in particular, I like to refer to two authors, Aristotle in the Greek context and Cicero. And I claim that the two of them are connected. There are people who would not agree with that, and of course that's a serious question, so I don't want to just be too direct in that, but my claim is that they belong to the same tradition, at least for our purposes. But I don't have time to deal with that, so I go to the early modern context and first see how the Protestant tradition tried to revitalize that ancient teaching of sociability. And I have got two heroes in this context, Melanchthon, Lipsius, and Althusius. All of them belonging to this reformed agenda, all of them belonging also to the humanist educational paradigm, and all of them try to combine a kind of Augustinian doubt about human nature, about sociability, and all of them try to make some sort of compromise on the issue and try to compromise that sort of Augustinian skepticism with sociability, with the Thomistic Aristotelian element in the Christian tradition. And in this respect, they are, I would claim, all of them influenced by Catholic authors as well. So it's not a particular Protestant position. And my attention, well, there are of course references here to Aristotle and Cicero in Melanchthon's case, and what we see is that even if the human being is after the fall polluted by sin, there is a chance for, well, in those days, him to try to get over it, at least for the purposes of society. Why? Because of being created in the image of God. So there is, on the one sense, this fallen man. On the other side, we have got someone who resembles Christ, and that way is able to live out the natural conditions of being sociable. And in that, of course, Melanchthon wants to rely on education that leads to moral development. The other guy, Justus Lipsius, again, someone who has got this humanistic background, again, someone who has got quite serious doubts. It's in this case, it's the Stoic influence and not so much the Augustinian, but I think that the two are not too far away from each other. And still we see an effort to try to concentrate in the theory on concord, on the way that you can negotiate these egoistic agents. In this case, there is a requirement for a strong ruler as well. So I do not want to present Lipsius's case as a rule of law in the Oxfordian sense, but yes, it is an ordered society, and these fallen creatures can live in peace and order. So there is a chance to find this sociable elements in human nature. And the third one, Johannes Althusius, is perhaps the most important one. Why? Because he has got actual experience as a magistrate in Emden, but he has already written by that time his piece on politics, which is very thoughtful reconstruction of Aristotelian ideas of politics. And the main argument that he presents is that politics is nothing less but the art of associating men for the purpose of establishing, cultivating, and conserving social life among them. So in fact, already that's the first major statement in the book. So it's really in the Aristotelian line that he wants to see a human being as sociable, as someone who can cultivate society. And in a very nice and reasoned way, he shows how it can be possible. And the concept that he relies on is symbiosis, a concept that shows that, in fact, there is no way for humans to live without this sort of negotiations among themselves. So in a way, he presents the human being as dependent on that co-association, which is the basis of human society. Okay, let's run on. Well, it's perhaps important to point out that he, again, like Aristotle, tries to show that, of course, there are differences between communities as far as their size is concerned, and that, in fact, the ideal case is always the smaller one, not the large empires and the new states that are emerging in those days, as long as they were emerging and not destroying each other. But basically, he, as a civil magistrate of a middle-sized town in North Germany, he was, quite engaged with that sort of level or size of the community. And I think that's important, actually. I think that even today, when we try to make sense of the connection between the individual and the community, the size of the community matters a lot, and perhaps we should downgrade our assumptions in political philosophy in order to recapture that sociability that Aristotle is talking about. Anyway, that was the Protestant way. And I bring from the Catholic tradition Giovanni Botero here, because I think that he presents another part that might be relevant for our later conceptualization, and that's the concept of reason of state. Botero was an opponent of Machiavelli, a contemporary and an opponent of Machiavelli. And the way that he also importantly, he was a Jesuit, a philosopher who taught for decades for the Jesuits, and then he had to leave the order, and then he became a diplomat and a political advisor. And he, in a way, very nicely combines this scholastic tradition with actually with the discoveries of Machiavelli, or the innovations of Machiavelli. And the concept of the reason of state is itself quite important, because I think that it refers to this realistic tradition in modernity, and it enables Christians to talk about the sort of rationality that is required in politics, and present it as a virtue, as in fact a Christian virtue. Okay, well, a third point in this early period is the concept of persona and self-fashioning. I think it's important if we want to work out the concept of the person, then we need to understand that it is actually in this early modern period that the persona was conceptualized as something that you create for yourself in order to present yourself in society, in the court society of the 16th and early 17th century. And again, it's important because it shows us that there is a kind of possibility for individuals to create their own selves quite freely and creatively as the requirements would demand. And that's something new. It was not obvious, although the concept of persona comes from Cicero to this discussion, and I think that it quite easily fits together with the with Bottero's understanding of political rationality. I think that the concept of prudence is in fact the idea that is behind all these discussions. And then we jump into the German Enlightenment context, and here we take three examples talking about sociability as a natural and an unsocial kind of thing. Well, it was Pufendorf who started out talking about this sort of sociability, presenting in his natural law an idea that natural law is based on the assumption of socialitas, sociality. And this is, I think, quite important. Of course, his main idol was Grotius, but he, in a way, became more important than Grotius, at least for this German Enlightenment context. And why? Because he presents natural law not so much as the one that comes from the scholastic tradition, but as something that is connected to the new discussion of human nature. And of course, Pufendorf's basic idea is connected to this Protestant skepticism about human nature. And again, he tries to show that even if human beings are self-loving or egoistic, there is in them the capacity to become useful members of society. So he always tries to negotiate, to balance the sociable and the egoistic element. And Thomasius takes out from that tradition the sociable element, and that's less interesting for us. It's a bit shallow, one can say, than the understanding of the sociable quality of human beings as a naturally given condition. I think that Kant is more interesting for us here. He has got an argument in 5 steps. Let's try to put all of them on the screen. He is using this term of unsocial sociability Geselligkeit, when he says that, well, basically there is this inclination to associate. Okay, he accepts the Aristotelian first condition. However, he also takes this Protestant skeptical criticism of the human nature, and he claims that there is a propensity to isolate. And then what comes out of the two? He says that it is in fact quite useful for the human being to have this propensity, this inclination to isolate, because that is the source of competition between different individuals. And through this opposition, in fact, they get into contact with each other. So they rely on each other because they want to be recognized. We are quite near here to Hegel, in fact, to where we started this afternoon. And in fact, it's a very eloquent proof that through this competitive, egoistic motivation of human beings, in fact, we arrive to a kind of sociability which is based on this unsociable precondition. And the development is, of course, historical, which is quite exceptional in Kant, by the way, and which is quite Hegelian as well. Because, as with Melanchthon, we need education to be able to work out, to get from the egoistic position to this competitive position. The individual has to learn certain things to get moral progress. Okay, there is a need to jump to the last part of the section to connect the Enlightenment discourse and the 20th century context. I did not really work out that part, but there are some hints of how to connect that. But I don't have a full version of that. So we can jump to the third part of my talk, which is actually the alternative to the liberal conception of the individual as opposed to society. And this is, well, here I call it Christian social teaching, but I take it from the Catholic social teaching, so it's biased perhaps, but let's call it Christian anyway. And well, perhaps the historical part is less important. It starts out in late 19th century contexts and influenced by German philosophers. And I try to recapture the main conceptual connections network through these two authors, Josef Höfner and Karol Wojtyla. I think that they can be used quite well together, and that helps to see the basic conceptual framework that we have here. The way that they present the case is this. There are two ways that one can make a mistake in the connection between the individual and society, the individual and the state. Sometimes they use one term, sometimes the other, but in the German context it is mostly understood that the state is the final level of the political community. Anyway, the two mistakes are these. One is when we take the individual as our main focus. And I think that this was the starting point that I attributed to Rawls and Berlin. When the individual good is regarded as more important than the common good, and this they call individualism, and they also associate it with liberalism and with capitalism in the economic sense of the word. On the other side, we have got the society and its mistake when they try to suppress the individual, subordinate the individual good or personal good to the common good, and that's the error of totalitarianism. Again, a mistake that was committed in the 20th century. And from these two alternatives, they look for a third way of imagining this connection, this interface between the individual and her society. And they want to keep the dignity of the person, but they also want to show that this personality is by nature social. So they claim that the two do not exclude each other. On the contrary, they required each other. That personal dignity is unimaginable without claiming sociability, and vice versa. You cannot be sociable without having that sort of interest in your own self. And in fact, what they show is that even the principle of solidarity, of that sort of communal feeling that is required in a strong concept of the political community, cannot be conceptualized without these two, the idea of personal dignity and sociability. And both of them are important to work out this new model. And the new model is basically a model in which the person is both standing alone as the final aim of human existence, and on the other hand as basically connected to the others. So there is these two elements to it, that it refers to itself and it refers to the other. The two do not exclude each other. The two are dependent on each other. And that's how they get to the idea of the common good. It is not the opposite of the individual good. What needs to be understood is that they again are conceptually dependent on each other. And in fact, there is a slight debate between them, because one of them claims that, and that's Höfner, that in fact the personhood is the stronger concept, and it still includes an interest in the common good, while Wojtyla argues the other way around, claiming that the common good is prior, but it does not exclude personhood. But basically, the thing is that they emphasize that the two go hand in hand, as opposed to the original individualistic idea. And perhaps the last notion that needs to be understood in this conceptual framework is subsidiarity, which means two things, and the two things do not seem to go easily with each other. In fact, they seem to be contradicting each other, but the claim is that they go hand in hand again. One is that subsidiarity means that the lower level is more important than the upper level. Here is where my Althusius comes into the picture. The smaller levels or the lower levels of social organizations are always better equipped to actually confront political situations and solve them. But it does not mean that you should exclude the case of the help from above. On the contrary, as in the church organizations, we in fact have to admit this possibility of the higher level intruding into the affairs of the lower level when there is a need for help. And that's the tricky thing about it, that subsidiarity is usually understood as a requirement to keep decisions on the lowest possible level, but that's not how they understand it. On the contrary, what they require is that there is a need for a balance between these two understandings. Again, the priority is on the lower level, but the superior level might need to intrude. And I think that if we take this personalist account of the person in the social teaching of the church, we can perhaps go and work out what I would call a Christian political realist position. And to do that, what is required is, first of all, try to accept this balance between the community and the individual. So the link needs to be strengthened. It should not be cut even for methodological purposes. The balance needs to be kept between the individual and her community. And secondly, there is a need to turn that teaching more practical. And that's the Aristotelian element that needs to be included, i.e. to try to bring it more down to earth, to try to combine it with the teaching of political rationality, political prudence, the concept of virtuous ruler, the concept of a virtuous citizen. And again here we can rely on the wisdom of the early modern theorists who showed that in fact society cannot work without that sort of practical knowledge that is required both from the ruler or the magistrate and from the ordinary citizen, from the community. Well, that's the way that I want to push this story, and I'm happy to hear comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a very rich talk, and there are already some hands up for questions. So let's start with Alexander Norman.
I just wanted to ask,
if you,
sorry, just wanted to ask whether there might be a connection between what you talk about, sociability, connection between self and community, and whether perhaps empathy provides the basis for that sociability.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's I think quite a logical question, and well, the exact term that we want to use might be a question, but but my own preference would be for sympathy. But it's a terminological question, and I'm open to negotiate on that. but in fact, sociability, the concept itself requires that sort of analysis of how to reach out for the other, and I think in that respect it is quite useful.
And Nicholas.
Thank you very much. A comment and a question. There's some extraordinary resources that you're drawing on, but I noted the absence of a contemporary Catholic philosopher who I thought would be there, which is Robert Spemann, someone who's written extensively about the question of persons and community. But the question I wanted to ask was, you said that the practical problem is that of multicultural, or one of the practical problems is that of multiculturalism. How is it that you think this problem can be resolved practically? Someone like John Finnis, who I have a great deal of respect for, has, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting him here, suggested that actually we invite people who can't assimilate to a certain culture to leave. Now, I don't know whether you think that's the correct way of going about restoring community to a nation. What would you suggest?
Well, thank you for both. Let me just make a remark on the comment. It is actually in this part where I should work out this Spemann relationship. Also through Böckenförde I could arrive there. So there is a connection, I think, here, and in fact Joachim Ritter is again someone who comes into one's mind, who is relying on this Aristotelian tradition and working in a Christian context, reworks that. So thank you for the idea, and he is actually on my reading list. As for your question, which you quite diplomatically attributed to Finnis, let me say this: I think that indeed there is no chance, I think, to arrive to a harmonious and easy solution through this opting out. But what I would suggest is this: there is a need for, as I mentioned, multiculturalism is problematic because what you require in a political community is one culture. In what sense? One political culture. You need to have people brought up in the same political culture. And I think that there is no logical impossibility to combine multiculturalism and one political culture. And I think that in this sense the paper on Oakeshott was quite useful, because I think that what Oakeshott shows you is that in fact you can have very different priorities as far as your personal life is concerned, as far as your Weltanschauung is concerned. What is important is your procedural culture, your habits, your ways of doing things, your processes. So it's a procedural question, and I think that it's easy to acquire it. If you live long enough in a community, you will sooner or later learn it just by being part of that practice.
The question at the front here.
I just wanted to ask, I suppose this is just a factual question, about the understanding of collective good that's in play in Catholic social teaching. I mean, with anyone's familiar enough with an idea of individual good in terms of flourishing or something like that. And there's a crude idea of collective good as just an aggregate of individual goods, which I take it is not what's in play here, although of course I don't know. So I'm wondering, is that indeed not what is in play here? And if not, what is the understanding of collective good which is being set against individual good?
Well, the way that they call it is common good traditionally, and I think there is a difference between collective and common good. But basically, the idea is that there are certain. So it's not just an aggregation of individual goods. What is here? Let me give an example that is. Well, this is the diplomatic way to presenting it. A reference. Which I would make to Charles Taylor, who presents the case of listening to music at home, each of us alone with a wonderful DVD or CD or whatever is the high quality performance made possible by these technical devices, and an experience of a concert that you are present at when you listen to music together. It's a wholly different experience, and it's not just an aggregation of the individual experiences at home, but something different. And a further step might be made, I don't recall that Taylor does that, when you are the performers themselves. So you are a member of a choir. I think that shows you the difference between being an individual player and someone presenting a performance together with people, with the others. I think that's a wholly different experience.
I think that's a very interesting analysis, and certainly these kinds of goods exist. But they're not, I don't know if that's opposed to an individual good. It seems like it's a special kind of individual good which can only exist in community with others. Or, is that good, does that exist over and above these individual experiences of collective effervescence? Or
I'm sorry, I cannot catch it.
Is there a... these thinkers are talking about an opposition between one's individual good and a communal good, and then how to balance those. I can't see that, although I agree that the kind of good that you refer to exists, I can't see that could be in tension with individual good in the way that they are suggesting.
No, there is no intention. The idea is that they go hand in hand. So you don't sacrifice one for the other. No, that's not the point, actually. They are different spheres of your life. It's the moment when you are alone and the moment when you act together with someone else or with someone else's. There are moments when you feel that history is on, when you are part of something happening indeed. In your country or in your city or in your university, and these are the examples, the moments when you feel that there are common goods, not just individual ones.
That's very helpful.
Richard Elliott has a question.
Yes, thank you. Just picking up on the point just made about aesthetic participation and trying to dissolve the tension between community and individual. We find that in Hegel. We also find that in the early works of Nietzsche. And insofar as how I read Nietzsche, he seems to be saying that the way that that dissolution between the individual's own personal desires and wants and the overarching or transcendent understanding of community, as it was understood for the Greeks, has a predominantly religious foundation. And obviously Nietzsche has his death of God thought, and his reaction to that is a very sort of stark individualism. Your presentation has concerned a Christian, realistic mode of practice to try and remedy this dissolution. But do you see any possibility for a non-religious practical mode of dissolving this tension?
Well, of course, we are in a situation when the state is secular. So, in that sense, my own position is not, it's not a political theology. It's not, arguments for a Christian state or something like that. It's just, thinking over the problem of Habermas and Ratzinger, how to, help out our modern secular societies when it cannot recreate its own moral foundations. And I think that in that sense the experience of Christian communities is helpful. That's all that needs to be said, and that needs to be taken into account. So it's not for a return into a religiously founded society. And one more thing, I think that this secularization process was in a way exaggerated in the 19th century, and by now I think that there are strong arguments that in fact politics is embedded into a religious conceptually, and also as far as basic convictions are concerned. It's very much rooted into religious views. So the idea that you can dissociate the two is not so easily done as it was in the 19th century. Of course, by now, conceptually, you could divide the two, and you could create a state that is non-confessional. But I think that to understand politics is impossible without taking into account the experience of religion. That's what I want to say.
Was there a question at the back there? I thought. Oh, there's a question there. Oh, didn't see that.
A teacher of mine was saying something about Aristotle's relationship to rarefying phenomena, in the way that the lady earlier on was alluding to the grasping at the inherent nature of phenomena and therefore being a fundamental misgood or whatever. Would you have anything to say about that, the rarefication of phenomena? Perhaps the lady would know how to put this question better than I. Well, Alan Wallace was saying something about Aristotle and the nature of rarefying phenomena in negative ways. And he said that Aristotle was basically responsible for having scientists follow him since he lived in those ways of rarefied phenomena.
I'm awfully sorry, I really don't know. I would have to listen to what Alan Wallace is saying to be able to get the detail of. I'm sorry, I don't know. Sorry.
But you know what I'm saying about the word rarefication?
I don't really.
Are you aware of that? Between Buddhism and
No.
and Christianity.
I think it's very technical, and it may have different meanings in different contexts.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, we might have time for one last question, and I'd like to ask it. It's a small point about the genesis of the practical problem that you have begun with. In an earlier talk today, Jakob Burda suggested that the decomposition of contemporary societies is caused by the individualization, an over-individualization of the human person, whereas the sense I'm getting from your talk that you want to see this logical relation of the individual and community reversed. You want to say that the decomposition of the society based on certain principles might lead to the over-individualization of persons that we see today and that Jakob was complaining about. Is that would you agree with that, or am I reading something into your talk that wasn't there at all?
Well, I cannot really see how the two would go. I mean, Jakob was talking about subjectivity or something, super subjectivity or whatever. I did not mean that as far as the Rawlsian position is concerned. So, although individualism is a term that I used basically in this Catholic context of the 20th century, when they criticized Western society for an overemphasis on the individual as opposed to the links to community. But that does not mean that what I require is to change the mentality of the individual to just to require certain actions or a way of life to be changed. It's not the point. This is not a program for reforming society. On the contrary, it's just showing how a society can actually preserve itself. That's the program. It claims that in order to keep governability, internal order and external defense, you require certain conditions, and one condition is that there is a need for this interest in the common good, as opposed to as conceptually differentiated from the individual good. That's all. It's not for a program of re-educating citizens or something like that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ferenc, for a wonderful talk.